They filed for guardianship without telling me. The court transcript proved they'd never even visited him. I want to start with that sentence, because for nearly 6 years, I served as the sole legal guardian for my younger brother, managing every aspect of his care with the patient, sustained attention his specific needs genuinely required, only to discover, entirely by accident, that my own sister had quietly filed a petition seeking to transfer that guardianship to herself. A petition built almost entirely on characterizations of my care that court records would eventually prove she had no genuine, first-hand basis for making. I want to tell you exactly how I discovered this, and exactly what it took to prove the truth in a way no court could dismiss, because I think, if you've ever poured years of genuine, exhausting devotion into caring for someone vulnerable, only to have that care questioned by someone who never actually witnessed it, you already understand the particular, cold clarity that arrives once you finally see the actual paperwork. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about protecting the people we love when they're least able to protect themselves, and the specific, undeniable proof that eventually exposes an unfounded challenge for exactly what it is. If any part of this story feels close to your own family, I hope it gives you the same clarity it eventually gave me. My name is Naomi. I am 42 years old, and 18 months ago, I discovered that my younger sister had filed a formal petition with our county probate court seeking to transfer legal guardianship of our autistic adult brother from me to herself, a petition that characterized my 6 years of daily sustained care as inadequate and neglectful, despite the fact that she had not personally visited our brother in over 4 years. I want to tell you about my brother, Simon, first, because understanding his specific needs and our family's history matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Simon is 38 years old, 4 years older than me, and he was diagnosed with autism at a young age, back when our region's diagnostic and support resources for autism spectrum conditions remained considerably more limited than what families navigate today. Simon requires substantial daily support managing his own personal care, his medication schedule, and the countless practical logistics of daily life, though he also possesses genuine capabilities and preferences that I have always worked to honor and support rather than simply manage. I remember, growing up alongside Simon, learning early on the particular rhythm his own comfort required, understanding which specific textures of clothing genuinely bothered him, which sounds could quickly overwhelm him in a crowded room, and which small, consistent routines helped him navigate an often unpredictable world with considerably more ease. I remember our parents working tirelessly throughout my own childhood to secure whatever limited therapeutic and educational support existed at the time, driving Simon to specialists nearly 2 hours away for years before more local resources eventually became available. I remember, too, Simon's own genuine joys, his specific delighted laugh whenever a particular song came on the radio, his careful, patient attention to jigsaw puzzles that could occupy him happily for hours, small windows into a person who was never simply defined by his diagnosis, but who carried his own distinct, genuine personality throughout our entire shared childhood. I want to tell you about how I became Simon's legal guardian, because understanding this specific history matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Our parents cared for Simon throughout most of his adult life, until our father passed away 8 years ago, and our mother's own health began declining significantly shortly afterward, making it clear that a more permanent, formal care arrangement would eventually need to be established for Simon's long-term well-being. I remember our father's death with a particular complicated grief, understanding that he had always been Simon's most steady, patient advocate, the parent who most naturally understood how to communicate with Simon in the specific way that felt genuinely comfortable and respectful to him. I remember the difficult months following his passing, watching our mother struggle considerably more than any of us had anticipated, her own grief compounding with the physical demands of managing Simon's care largely alone for the first time in decades. I remember specific weekend visits home during this period, finding our mother increasingly exhausted, and understanding, with a particular clarity, that our family's entire care arrangement for Simon was approaching a genuine, unavoidable turning point. I want to tell you about my sister, Kristen, because understanding her own relationship to our family and to Simon specifically matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Kristen is 3 years older than me, and she had moved considerably far from our childhood home in her mid-20s, eventually settling nearly 4 hours away, building her own career and family life in a different state entirely, a distance that meant her own involvement in our parents' care, and eventually Simon's care, remained considerably more limited than my own, given my own decision to remain in our home region specifically to help manage our family's ongoing needs. I remember Kristen's own departure from our childhood home clearly, a decision she made I always understood, largely to build her own independent life somewhat separate from the intense, sustained caregiving demands our family had always organized itself around. I don't think this decision reflected any genuine lack of love for Simon on her part, simply a different, understandable choice about how to structure her own adult life, one that took her considerably further from our family's ongoing daily reality than my own choice ultimately did. I remember her occasional visits home during those years, genuinely warm in the moment but increasingly infrequent as her own career and family responsibilities in her distant state continued expanding. A pattern that felt, at the time, like simply the ordinary reality of adult siblings building separate lives, rather than anything I anticipated would eventually become so significant. I remember, too, a specific conversation with Kristen years before any of this happened, during one of her earlier, more frequent visits home, where she mentioned, almost in passing, that she sometimes felt a quiet guilt watching me manage so much of our family's ongoing needs alone. I remember reassuring her, at the time, that I genuinely didn't resent the different paths our lives had taken, that I understood her own choices as simply different rather than lesser, a reassurance I meant genuinely but that I now understand, looking back, likely never fully addressed whatever deeper unease she continued privately carrying about her own relative absence. I want to tell you about the specific circumstances that led to me becoming Simon's formal legal guardian 6 years ago, because understanding this process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. When our mother's own health decline made it clear she could no longer serve as Simon's primary caregiver, our family, including Kristen, discussed the situation together, and I formally agreed to take on legal guardianship, a decision that reflected both my closer physical proximity and my own professional background, working as an occupational therapist. Experience that gave me genuine, specific expertise relevant to Simon's particular support needs. I remember that specific family conversation clearly, held at our mother's kitchen table, all three of us discussing, as honestly as we could manage, what long-term arrangement would genuinely serve Simon best going forward. I remember Kristen herself acknowledging, at the time, that her own distance made taking on primary guardianship impractical. And I remember her expressing genuine gratitude that I was willing and able to take on this considerable responsibility myself. I remember feeling, in that specific moment, a mixture of genuine acceptance of what I understood would be a significant, lifelong commitment, alongside a quieter, more private determination that I wanted to do this well, understanding exactly how much Simon's own stability and well-being would depend on the specific quality of care I was agreeing to provide. I want to describe the specific formal guardianship process, because understanding its careful, legally rigorous nature matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Establishing formal legal guardianship required a comprehensive court evaluation, including a formal capacity assessment for Simon himself, extensive documentation of my own ability to provide appropriate care, and a court-appointed evaluator's independent assessment confirming that this specific arrangement served Simon's genuine best interests. I remember this evaluation process taking several months, involving detailed interviews, home visits, and careful documentation of my own proposed care plan. A rigorous process that, I remember thinking at the time, existed precisely to ensure that guardianship arrangements were genuinely appropriate rather than simply convenient family decisions made without proper, careful scrutiny. I remember feeling, throughout this process, a specific determination to demonstrate not just my willingness but my genuine, informed capability to provide Simon the kind of care his particular needs required, understanding that whatever the court ultimately decided would shape the entire remaining trajectory of both our lives. I want to tell you about the following 6 years of caring for Simon, because understanding this genuine, sustained commitment matters enormously for understanding exactly what was actually at stake in everything that eventually happened. I moved into a house specifically chosen for its proximity to Simon's own apartment, a supported independent living arrangement that allowed him considerable autonomy while ensuring I remained close enough to provide daily support and be available for any emergency that might arise. I managed his medical appointments, his medication schedule, his daily living support services, and the countless smaller, ongoing decisions that genuine guardianship for someone with Simon's specific needs actually requires. I remember the specific rhythm of those 6 years, checking in with Simon most mornings before my own work, coordinating with his rotating support staff to ensure consistent, appropriate care throughout each week, attending his medical appointments personally to ensure his specific communication needs were properly understood and respected by each new provider. I remember specific challenges we navigated together, a difficult medication adjustment period during my 3rd year of guardianship that required weeks of careful monitoring and coordination with his physician, a change in his support staff that initially caused him genuine distress until we worked through a careful transition process together. I remember, too, the specific joys of these years, celebrating small, meaningful milestones in his own developing independence, watching him grow more confident managing certain daily tasks himself, the particular pride I felt watching him navigate his own increasingly independent life, with the genuine care and support his specific needs required. I remember specifically the year Simon learned to manage his own weekly grocery shopping with only minimal support, a goal we had worked toward gradually over nearly 18 months, breaking the task down into manageable steps, practicing repeatedly with his occupational therapist until he felt genuinely confident navigating the store independently. I remember the specific pride on his face the first time he returned from the store entirely on his own, proudly showing me exactly what he'd purchased, understanding, in that small, ordinary moment, precisely why the patient, sustained work of genuine guardianship mattered so much more than any single, dramatic gesture ever could. I want to tell you about Kristen's own relationship to Simon throughout these 6 years, because understanding this genuine distance matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Kristen visited Simon only occasionally throughout this entire period, typically during major holidays, visits that grew increasingly infrequent as her own family and professional responsibilities in her distant state continued expanding. I want to be honest that her last actual in-person visit with Simon occurred slightly over 4 years before everything I'm about to describe took place, a fact that would eventually become critically significant. I remember specific holiday visits during the earlier years of my guardianship, Kristen arriving with her own young children, Simon genuinely delighted by these gatherings despite requiring some additional preparation and support to manage the change in his usual routine. I remember, gradually, these visits becoming less frequent, Kristen's own explanations always reasonable in the moment, her children's school schedules, her own demanding career, the considerable distance and expense involved in traveling with her family, explanations I genuinely understood and never held against her at the time, given how ordinary these kinds of gradual distances often become within busy adult sibling relationships. I remember our phone conversations continuing periodically throughout these years, brief but generally warm, Kristen asking after Simon's general well-being, myself offering brief, reassuring updates that, I understand now, likely never conveyed the actual detailed texture of his daily life and care in the way an in-person visit genuinely would have. I remember one particular missed visit, roughly 3 years into my guardianship, when Kristen had originally planned to bring her children for Simon's birthday. A trip canceled at the last moment due to a work conflict she described, apologetically, over the phone. I remember Simon's own quiet disappointment that day, understanding, even at the time, that these accumulating small absences, however individually reasonable, were gradually creating a considerable gap between Kristen's own understanding of Simon's life and its actual lived reality. A gap that would eventually prove significant in ways none of us anticipated at the time. I want to tell you about the specific circumstances that eventually led to my discovery of Kristen's guardianship petition, because this discovery emerged during an entirely unrelated administrative matter. Approximately 18 months ago, I received a routine notice from our county courthouse regarding an upcoming scheduled hearing related to Simon's guardianship. A notice that genuinely confused me, given that I had not personally requested any such hearing or been aware of any pending guardianship-related matter requiring court attention. I remember opening that envelope at my own kitchen table, an ordinary Tuesday evening, expecting perhaps some routine administrative matter related to Simon's annual guardianship review, a standard requirement I was already familiar with from previous years. I remember my confusion growing as I read through the formal legal language, understanding that this notice referenced an entirely different kind of proceeding than the routine reviews I had experienced before. Something specifically described as a petition for guardianship modification, language I had never previously encountered in relation to Simon's care. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this notice, because understanding my genuine confusion matters for everything that eventually happened. I contacted our county courthouse directly, requesting clarification regarding the scheduled hearing, and I want to describe what the court clerk explained, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. I remember making that phone call the following morning, my hands slightly unsteady as I dialed, some instinctive part of me already sensing that whatever I was about to learn would likely prove significant. I remember the clerk's careful, professional tone as she confirmed the case details, and I remember the specific, cold shock that settled over me as she explained exactly what this hearing actually concerned. The clerk explained that this hearing had been scheduled in response to a formal petition filed by Kristen, requesting that the court transfer Simon's legal guardianship from me to herself, citing specific concerns regarding what her petition characterized as inadequate ongoing care. I remember asking the clerk to repeat this explanation twice, genuinely struggling, in that first moment, to fully absorb what she was actually telling me, my own mind racing through the previous weeks and months trying to identify any conversation, any moment, where Kristen might have signaled even the smallest concern about Simon's care that I had somehow failed to notice or address. I remember thanking the clerk for her time, hanging up the phone, and simply sitting at my own kitchen table for a long while, staring at nothing in particular, trying to process the specific, disorienting betrayal of learning that my own sister had taken this significant step without ever once raising her concerns with me directly. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific detail, because it represents the actual moment I understood something considerably more troubling than simple administrative confusion was actually occurring. I sat in my own kitchen, phone still in my hand, feeling a specific, disorienting shock as I understood that my own sister had apparently, quietly, been working to challenge my guardianship of our brother, entirely without ever raising any concerns with me directly, despite our regular, if infrequent, communication throughout the preceding years. I want to tell you about the specific steps I took following this discovery, because understanding exactly how I approached investigating this situation further matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I requested formal copies of Kristen's actual petition from the court, understanding that I needed to fully understand the specific allegations being made before I could adequately prepare any response. I remember the specific days waiting for these documents to arrive, a strange, suspended period where I continued my ordinary daily routine, checking in with Simon, managing his usual appointments, all while carrying this enormous, unresolved uncertainty privately, understanding that whatever specific allegations Kristen had made would soon determine exactly how I needed to respond. I remember the envelope finally arriving, considerably thicker than I'd expected, and I remember sitting down at my own kitchen table before opening it, taking a slow, deliberate breath, understanding that I wanted to read whatever it contained with as much composure as I could genuinely manage. I want to tell you about what this petition actually contained, because its specific claims painted a picture considerably different from the genuine reality of Simon's actual care and well-being. Kristen's petition alleged that Simon had experienced declining well-being under my guardianship, citing concerns about his living conditions, his medical care, and his general quality of life. Characterizations that struck me, reading them, as genuinely disconnected from the actual, documented reality of Simon's situation throughout the preceding years. I remember reading through the specific language of this petition at my own kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I worked through each paragraph. Kristen's own words describing concerns about my care that felt, to me, almost unrecognizable given everything I actually knew about Simon's daily life and well-being. I remember one particular passage that struck me especially hard. Kristen writing that she had grave concerns about Simon's happiness and stability, language that felt considerably more dramatic and alarming than anything the actual, documented reality of his life would have supported, had she taken the time to genuinely investigate before committing these characterizations to a formal legal document. I want to describe my reaction to reading these specific allegations, because understanding my genuine, complicated response matters for everything that eventually happened. I felt, reading through this petition, a specific mixture of genuine hurt and disbelief, understanding that these characterizations bore little resemblance to Simon's actual, well-documented circumstances, while also recognizing that I would need to respond to these allegations formally and thoroughly, rather than simply relying on my own genuine confidence that they were inaccurate. I remember calling a close friend that same evening, someone entirely outside our family situation, who could offer perspective uncomplicated by any personal connection to Kristen or Simon. And I remember articulating, out loud for the first time, exactly how disorienting it felt to discover that 6 years of careful, genuine devotion could be characterized so dramatically differently by someone who hadn't actually witnessed any of it directly. My friend, listening carefully, reminded me that whatever Kristen's petition claimed, the actual documented reality of Simon's life remained entirely unchanged, and that I simply needed to make that reality visible to the court in a way that couldn't reasonably be disputed. I want to tell you about the specific attorney I consulted, because her guidance shaped everything about how I eventually approached addressing this situation. I contacted an attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Ms. Kowalski, who specialized specifically in guardianship and family law matters, explaining the full situation and requesting guidance regarding both my legal options and the most effective way to demonstrate the genuine, documented reality of Simon's actual care and well-being. I remember our first meeting at her office, bringing with me copies of the petition alongside whatever documentation I could quickly gather regarding Simon's actual care, feeling genuinely overwhelmed but grateful to finally be sitting across from someone with the professional expertise to help me navigate this entirely unfamiliar legal territory. I remember her calm, methodical demeanor as she reviewed the petition, occasionally making notes, and I remember her telling me, directly, that petitions like this, based on limited or outdated information, were considerably more common than most families realized, and that the court's actual standard for transferring established guardianship required considerably more substantiated evidence than Kristen's petition appeared, on its surface, to contain. I want to tell you what Ms. Kowalski explained, because her guidance clarified exactly what kind of documentation would prove most decisive in addressing these specific allegations. She explained that guardianship transfer proceedings typically require the petitioning party to demonstrate genuine, substantiated concerns regarding a current guardian's care, and that thorough documentation of Simon's actual medical records, daily living support logs, and independent third-party assessments of his well-being would likely prove considerably more persuasive to the court than any general, unsubstantiated characterization Kristen's petition might contain. I want to describe the specific documentation I began compiling, because understanding this thorough process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I gathered 6 years of detailed care logs I had maintained throughout my entire guardianship, documenting Simon's daily activities, his medical appointments, his medication management, and his ongoing progress across various support goals we had worked on together with his care team. I remember spending an entire weekend organizing these records chronologically, spreading printed logs and appointment summaries across my own dining room table, understanding that whatever I ultimately presented needed to tell a clear, comprehensive story of consistent, genuine care rather than simply a scattered collection of individual documents. I remember feeling, throughout this process, a strange mixture of exhaustion and quiet vindication, rediscovering, through my own careful records, just how much sustained, detailed attention I had actually brought to Simon's care throughout those 6 years. Attention I had rarely paused to fully appreciate myself while simply living through the day-to-day reality of providing it. I remember, specifically, finding an old note I had written to myself nearly 4 years earlier, a small reminder about adjusting Simon's morning routine following a particular change in his medication. A tiny, unremarkable detail among hundreds of similar entries, but one that struck me, rereading it now, as exactly the kind of quiet, sustained attentiveness that genuine caregiving actually requires. The countless small adjustments and careful observations that rarely feel significant in any single moment but that, taken together across years, represent the actual substance of what it means to genuinely care for someone. I want to tell you about the specific independent professionals I contacted to help verify Simon's actual well-being, because their independent assessments would eventually prove decisive in addressing Kristen's specific allegations. I reached out to Simon's primary physician, his supported living coordinator, and his longtime occupational therapist, each of whom had worked directly with Simon throughout multiple years, requesting formal, written statements regarding their own independent observations of his actual care and well-being under my guardianship. I remember each of these conversations individually, calling professionals I had worked alongside for years, explaining the situation as calmly as I could manage despite my own genuine distress. And I remember each of them responding with immediate, genuine willingness to help, understanding, I think, exactly how important accurate documentation would prove in a situation like this. I remember Simon's occupational therapist telling me, directly, that she had witnessed firsthand, across years of regular sessions, exactly the kind of consistent, thoughtful care I provided, and that she would be glad to formally document her own professional observations to help protect both Simon's stability and my own reputation. I want to tell you about what these independent professionals eventually provided, because their documentation painted a picture entirely consistent with my own understanding of Simon's genuine well-being. Each of these professionals provided detailed, formal statements confirming Simon's consistent medical care, his stable and appropriate living situation, and his genuine, ongoing progress across multiple support goals. Statements that directly contradicted the specific concerns Kristen's petition had characterized. I want to tell you about the specific discovery that eventually revealed exactly why Kristen's petition contained such significant inaccuracies, because this discovery represents the actual turning point of this entire story. Working with Ms. Kowalski, we requested formal discovery regarding the specific basis for Kristen's petition, understanding that if her allegations rested on any genuine, documented concerns, this process would reveal exactly what evidence she believed supported her specific claims. I remember Ms. Kowalski explaining this discovery process to me carefully, describing how formal legal discovery would require Kristen to disclose the actual, specific basis for her allegations, understanding that petitions built on genuine, substantiated evidence typically survive this kind of scrutiny, while petitions built on assumption or limited information often reveal considerable gaps once formally examined. I remember feeling a specific, cautious hope during this period, understanding that whatever the eventual outcome, this process would at least ensure the actual truth of Simon's care finally received the careful, thorough examination it deserved. I want to describe what this discovery process eventually revealed, because the details fundamentally transformed my understanding of exactly how Kristen's petition had come to be filed. The discovery revealed that Kristen's petition had been based almost entirely on a single, brief phone conversation with Simon nearly 8 months earlier, during which Simon, who sometimes struggles with the specific language needed to articulate frustration about minor, temporary inconveniences, had mentioned some passing frustration about a temporary change in his support staff schedule, a completely ordinary, quickly resolved administrative adjustment that Kristen had apparently interpreted, without any further investigation, as evidence of significant, ongoing neglect. I remember reading through this specific discovery response with a particular, disbelieving clarity, understanding that Kristen had built an entire formal legal petition, one that had genuinely threatened Simon's stable, established care arrangement, based on a single, brief conversation she had apparently never followed up on with any further investigation, never contacting me, never speaking with Simon's actual care team, never visiting to observe his genuine circumstances directly before committing these serious allegations to a formal court filing. I remember calling Miss Kowalski immediately after reading through this discovery material, my own voice shaking slightly as I described what we had found. And I remember her calm, measured response, explaining that this specific gap, an entire formal legal petition built on a single, unverified conversation, would likely prove considerably significant to the court's eventual understanding of Kristen's actual basis for her allegations. I remember feeling, for the first time since receiving that original court notice months earlier, something closer to genuine confidence that the truth would ultimately prevail, understanding that whatever emotional pain this entire process had caused, the actual, documented facts remained unambiguously on my side. I remember, too, a specific conversation with Simon's occupational therapist around this same time, sharing what the discovery process had revealed, and I remember her genuine, quiet outrage on Simon's behalf, understanding, as a professional who had witnessed his actual, consistent care firsthand for years, exactly how disconnected Kristen's allegations had proven to be from anything she had ever personally observed. She told me directly that she felt genuinely grateful the court process existed specifically to require this kind of substantiated evidence, understanding how easily an unfounded allegation, left unchallenged, might otherwise have disrupted Simon's carefully built stability without any genuine justification. I want to tell you about the specific court hearing where this discovery was formally presented, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. Ms. Kowalski and I attended the scheduled hearing, prepared with our comprehensive documentation, and I want to describe how this hearing unfolded, because the specific way it proceeded matters considerably for understanding the genuine, complete resolution this entire situation eventually reached. I remember the specific courtroom that morning, considerably smaller and more modest than I had somehow expected, Kristen arriving separately with her own attorney, both of us carefully avoiding direct eye contact as we settled into our respective seats. I remember my own hands trembling slightly as Ms. Kowalski arranged our documentation on the table in front of us, understanding that whatever happened over the following hour would likely determine not just Simon's immediate future, but the entire remaining trajectory of my relationship with my own sister. I did not raise my voice through any part of this hearing. I had learned, through everything this particular situation had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. Ms. Kowalski presented our comprehensive documentation methodically, walking the court through 6 years of detailed care logs, independent professional assessments, and the specific timeline establishing that Kristen's last actual, in-person visit with Simon had occurred over 4 years before she filed her petition, alleging current, ongoing neglect she had no genuine, first-hand basis for observing. I remember watching the judge's expression shift gradually throughout this presentation, from a kind of neutral, professional attentiveness towards something closer to genuine concern as the specific timeline and evidentiary gaps in Kristen's petition became increasingly apparent. I remember Simon's occupational therapist's written statement being read aloud in particular detail, describing years of consistent, careful observation that directly, specifically contradicted the concerns Kristen's petition had characterized. I want to describe the court's reaction to this presentation, because understanding this response matters enormously for the eventual resolution of this entire story. The judge, reviewing this comprehensive documentation alongside the specific timeline establishing Kristen's limited recent contact with Simon, asked her directly whether she had, in fact, personally visited Simon at any point during the 4 years preceding her petition, a question that produced a lengthy, visibly uncomfortable silence before she acknowledged that she had not. I remember that specific silence stretching on for what felt like an unusually long time, Kristen's own attorney glancing toward her with an expression I couldn't quite read, before she finally, quietly admitted the truth. I remember feeling in that exact moment, not triumph exactly, but a specific, quiet relief that the actual truth was finally, unambiguously visible to everyone present in that room. I want to tell you about the court's eventual ruling, because understanding this outcome matters for the complete resolution of this entire story. The court denied Kristen's petition entirely, finding that her allegations were not supported by any genuine, current first-hand knowledge of Simon's actual circumstances, and specifically noting, in its written ruling, that the comprehensive documentation I had provided demonstrated consistent, appropriate care considerably exceeding the standard required to maintain guardianship. I remember receiving the court's final written ruling several weeks after the actual hearing, reading through its careful, measured language, and feeling a specific, complicated wave of emotion, genuine relief that Simon's stability had been formally, legally protected, alongside a lingering exhaustion from the months of anxiety this entire process had required. I remember calling Miss Kowalski to thank her for her careful, thorough work, and I remember her telling me, kindly, that the actual outcome had been determined less by her own advocacy and more by the simple, undeniable strength of the documented reality I had built through 6 years of genuine, consistent care. I want to tell you about the conversation I eventually had with Kristen following this ruling, because understanding her own perspective matters for the complete, honest resolution of this entire story. I contacted Kristen directly, several weeks after the hearing, wanting to understand her own genuine reasoning for pursuing this petition, given how disconnected it had proven to be from Simon's actual, documented circumstances. I remember that phone call taking place on a quiet evening, both of us considerably calmer than we'd managed during the actual hearing itself. Some space and time having passed that allowed for a more genuine, less defensive conversation than would have been possible immediately afterward. I remember Kristen's voice carrying a specific, tired quality I hadn't heard from her before, evidence, I think, of her own genuine exhaustion processing everything that had happened over the preceding months. I want to tell you what Kristen eventually explained, because her reasoning revealed something considerably more complicated than simple malice or deliberate deception. She told me, with visible difficulty, that she had felt a specific, persistent guilt throughout recent years regarding her own limited involvement in Simon's care, a guilt that had gradually transformed, she admitted, into a kind of defensive conviction that something must genuinely be wrong with his current care. Understanding, on some level, that if his situation were genuinely fine, her own absence would feel considerably harder to justify to herself. I remember her describing, specifically, a particular late-night months before she filed her petition, lying awake after that brief phone call with Simon, his passing comment about the schedule change replaying in her mind until it had transformed, through her own anxious, guilty imagination, into something considerably more alarming than the ordinary, minor frustration it actually represented. I remember her admitting that some part of her had wanted to believe something was genuinely wrong, understanding, with painful self-awareness, that this belief would have offered a strange kind of relief, transforming her own guilt about distance into righteous concern about my supposed inadequacy instead. I want to be honest with you about my reaction to this explanation, because I think it matters for understanding the genuinely complicated resolution this entire story eventually reached. I did not feel simple, uncomplicated anger upon hearing this explanation. though I want to acknowledge that anger was certainly part of my initial reaction throughout this entire ordeal. I felt, instead, something considerably more layered, understanding that Kristen's actions, however genuinely harmful and disruptive, had emerged from a specific, painful guilt rather than any deliberate desire to harm either Simon or myself. I remember sitting with this understanding for several days following our conversation, working through my own complicated feelings, recognizing that forgiveness, in this specific situation, didn't need to mean pretending the genuine harm Kristen's actions caused simply didn't matter, but rather choosing to understand that harm within its actual, complete context, rather than reducing her entirely to the single, most damaging decision she had made. I thought often, during this period, about my own professional training as an occupational therapist, understanding from years of working with families navigating their own complicated grief and guilt, that unexamined emotion often finds destructive outlets precisely because the person carrying it has never had genuine space to process it honestly. I want to tell you about the specific resolution Kristen and I eventually reached, because I think it represents a genuinely thoughtful, if imperfect, path toward addressing what had happened. I told Kristen, directly, that I understood her underlying guilt, but that her specific choice to act on unsubstantiated assumptions rather than simply reaching out to genuinely understand Simon's actual circumstances had caused significant, unnecessary disruption during a period that should have remained stable and secure for our brother. I remember her crying quietly on the other end of the phone as I said this, apologizing repeatedly, and I remember telling her, gently but firmly, that I appreciated her apology, but that what actually mattered going forward was not simply words of regret, but a genuine sustained change in how she chose to engage with Simon's life. I remember feeling, throughout this specific portion of our conversation, a careful balance between genuine compassion for whatever pain had driven her actions, and an equally genuine insistence that this pain never justified the disruption it had caused to Simon's own carefully protected stability. I want to tell you about the specific path forward we eventually established, because understanding this resolution matters for the complete story of everything that happened. I proposed that Kristen begin a more genuine, sustained involvement in Simon's life going forward, understanding that regular, actual visits and direct communication with his care team would give her the kind of accurate, first-hand understanding that her previous, more distant relationship had never actually provided. I remember outlining this proposal carefully during our conversation, suggesting specific, concrete steps rather than simply a vague commitment to doing better, monthly video calls with Simon that I would help facilitate, at least 2 in-person visits annually, and direct, ongoing communication with his occupational therapist and support coordinator, so that her own understanding of his actual circumstances would no longer depend entirely on brief, occasional phone conversations easily misinterpreted. I remember Kristen agreeing to this proposal readily, with what struck me as genuine relief at being offered a concrete path forward rather than simply being permanently cut off from her own brother's life as a consequence of what she had done. I remember, too, suggesting that Kristen might benefit from speaking with someone professionally about the specific guilt she had described carrying for years. Understanding that this entire situation had revealed something considerably deeper than simply a misunderstanding about Simon's care, a genuine, unresolved emotional weight that deserved its own careful attention, separate from anything specifically related to Simon himself. I remember her considering this suggestion thoughtfully, eventually telling me, several weeks later, that she had, in fact, begun seeing a therapist regularly, working through not just her guilt about Simon specifically, but broader patterns in how she had navigated distance and avoidance throughout much of her adult life. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several months removed from that difficult court hearing. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this clearly through documented evidence. I feel, instead, something considerably more complicated, genuine relief that Simon's stable, appropriate care was ultimately protected, alongside profound, ongoing grief that my own sister had been willing to challenge my care so significantly based on assumptions rather than genuine investigation. Kristen has, in the months since this resolution, genuinely followed through on the commitments we discussed, visiting Simon twice already, video calling him monthly, and reaching out directly to his care team to build the kind of genuine, informed understanding she had never previously prioritized. I remember her most recent visit, watching her sit patiently with Simon through one of his favorite puzzle activities, asking him genuine, specific questions about his own daily life rather than simply the brief, general check-ins that had characterized our previous phone conversations. I find myself, cautiously, allowing myself to hope that this entire difficult experience might ultimately result in a genuinely closer, more honest relationship between Kristen and Simon than existed before any of this happened. Even though I recognize that hope requires considerable, ongoing effort from all of us to actually sustain. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Thorough, ongoing documentation of caregiving matters enormously, even when we never anticipate needing to formally defend that care against a genuine challenge. My 6 years of detailed record keeping, maintained purely out of professional habit, ultimately provided exactly the evidence needed to protect both Simon's stability and my own genuine credibility. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that difficult hearing. Guilt, left unaddressed and unexamined, can sometimes transform into a kind of defensive conviction that genuinely harms the people we claim to be protecting. Kristen's actions didn't emerge from malice, but from an unexamined guilt that gradually convinced her that intervention represented genuine concern, rather than the significant disruption it actually caused. Here is a third truth. Independent, professional verification matters considerably more than personal conviction alone when addressing significant allegations regarding someone's care. My own confidence that Kristen's claims were inaccurate would never have carried sufficient weight on its own. It took independent professional documentation to establish this truth beyond reasonable dispute. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require permanently severing the relationships damaged by genuine conflict. I chose to work toward a path forward with Kristen rather than simply cutting her out of Simon's life entirely, understanding that Simon's own genuine well-being was better served by his sister's eventual, more informed involvement than by permanent estrangement. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully understand until watching Kristen's genuine effort over these past several months. Sometimes the people who cause us the deepest, most unexpected harm are capable of genuine, meaningful growth once the actual truth of a situation finally, fully confronts them, provided we're willing to offer a concrete, structured path toward rebuilding trust rather than simply demanding they somehow prove themselves in the abstract. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who challenge our most genuine, sustained devotion are not doing so out of cruelty, but out of their own complicated, unexamined feelings about their own absence and guilt. Recognizing this doesn't excuse the genuine harm such challenges can cause, but it does allow for a more complete, compassionate understanding of situations that might otherwise feel simply, purely adversarial. That is my story. 6 years of genuine, documented care, one routine court notice I nearly dismissed as an error, and one court hearing that finally revealed exactly how disconnected an unfounded challenge can be from someone's actual, well-documented reality. I think sometimes about that specific afternoon at our mother's kitchen table, all three of us discussing what would eventually become of Simon's care, none of us fully imagining at the time exactly what the following years would eventually bring. I don't regret my own decision to take on this responsibility, even now. Even knowing everything difficult that eventually happened, I think it's possible to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that Simon's care under my guardianship was always genuinely, thoroughly appropriate, and that my own sister, for reasons rooted more in her own unexamined guilt than genuine cruelty, still managed to cause significant, unnecessary disruption before finally, properly understanding the truth. I visited Simon just yesterday, watching him work through one of his favorite puzzles with the same patient concentration I remember from our own shared childhood, and I found myself thinking about everything this entire experience has taught me. not just about protecting Simon's stability through careful documentation, but about the particular, complicated grace required to extend genuine understanding towards someone who caused real harm out of their own unexamined pain. Simon himself, when I gently asked him how he felt about Kristen's more frequent visits lately, told me simply that he liked seeing his sister more, a small, uncomplicated truth that reminded me, once again, exactly why protecting his stability, and eventually rebuilding what Kristen's petition had threatened to damage, mattered so genuinely throughout this entire difficult process. I think, too, about my own continued role in this entire story, understanding that guardianship, at its genuine core, was never really about proving myself right against Kristen's mistaken allegations, but about the ongoing, sustained work of ensuring Simon's own life remains as stable, dignified, and genuinely his own as possible, regardless of whatever family conflict might occasionally threaten that stability from outside. I keep my own care logs still, the same detailed daily records that ultimately protected this entire arrangement, not out of any lingering anxiety that I'll need to defend myself again, but simply because I've come to understand, through this entire experience, exactly how valuable careful, consistent documentation genuinely is, both for protecting the people we love and for honoring, in its own quiet way, the actual accumulated weight of the care we provide them each and every day. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that genuine caregiving deserves careful documentation and protection, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time your own genuine efforts were challenged by someone who never took the time to understand the actual reality of what you were doing. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.